The humid August morning of 2009 began with an unusual stillness in the suburbs of Savannah. 3 unmarked GBI vehicles quietly pulled up in front of a small garage by the roadside, where the smell of grease and burnt metal was a familiar sight to the residents in the area. A few neighbors glanced through their windows as tactical-clad agents silently positioned themselves around the building. Inside, Ray Barlow was wiping his hands with an oily rag, maintaining the morning routine he had kept for years as a diligent, quiet worker who was almost invisible in everyone's eyes. The sharp call rang out at 8:14 a.m. Ray Barlow, GB, we have a warrant for your arrest, in connection with a 1990 case. The agents later recounted that his hand froze mid-motion, but his face retained an incomprehensible calm, as if he knew this moment would finally find him, even though he had tried to escape it for nearly 2 decades. Before diving deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The summer night of 1990 fell over Brunswick, Georgia, with heavy humid air thick with the smell of salt from the marshes and the lingering heat of the earth. After a stifling day, the old apartment rows near the port area were bathed in the yellow glow from weak streetlights, creating patchy pools of light amid the thick darkness. From afar came the incessant chirping of cicadas, occasionally mixing with the sound of a truck passing on the main road, before everything sank back into the hazy stillness typical of southern night. In the second-floor apartment at Turner Court, Laura Turner closed her daughter's bedroom door after saying goodnight. 8-year-old Ava Turner, her hair tied neatly in a ponytail, curled up on the small bed in the room she had only recently started getting used to over the past few weeks. Hot nights often made Ava crack the window slightly to let in the faint breeze from outside, and Laura always reminded her to keep the nightlight on because Ava still had a lingering fear of the dark like many other children. Laura returned to her own room trying to relax after a long day at work. The house at night seemed peaceful, with only the steady whir of the ceiling fan and the light wind rustling through the shared courtyard below. Nothing unusual happened, and there were no sounds loud enough to catch Laura's attention. Everything passed slowly like an ordinary, peaceful night that old apartment complexes sometimes provide. By morning the pale dawn light filtered through the living room blinds, and Laura woke up with her usual fatigue. She walked down the short hallway and opened Ava's door, intending to wake her for the new day. As soon as the door opened, Laura froze. The small bed was neatly made, but empty. The blankets and pillows were pushed to one side. The room was unnaturally quiet, with no small footsteps running to greet her, no bright good morning greeting like every other day. Ava was not in the room. Laura called her name softly at first, then louder, her voice breaking as she rushed to check the bathroom, the living room, every corner of the kitchen, all empty. A wave of unease surged intensely, like a cold stream running down her spine. She stood in the doorway of Ava's room, trying to find a reasonable explanation, but there was none, and when no other possibility remained to cling to, Laura's hands trembled as she reached for the phone on the kitchen shelf. She dialed emergency, her voice choking in her throat as she reported that her daughter had disappeared in the night. The final words of Laura Turner's emergency call had barely ended when, minutes later, the flashing blue and red lights of the first patrol car illuminated the old apartments at Turner Court, shattering the remaining morning silence. The Brunswick Police Department arrived immediately, and within minutes, a vehicle from the Glynn County Sheriff's Office joined, sealing off the entire area around the building. Yellow tape was stretched across, cutting off the once peaceful space of this working-class neighborhood, turning the second-floor hallway where the Turner family lived into the official scene of a child missing person case. The first 2 officers entered the apartment, guided by Laura. What they noticed first was the difference between a normal home and a space where something unusual might have occurred overnight. The living room showed no signs of disturbance. The kitchen was tidy. Everything retained the quiet of early morning. But upon entering Ava's bedroom, they immediately noted an unusually chilly atmosphere, as if the girl's absence still lingered in every corner. Ava's small bed was documented as showing no signs of struggle or violent movement during the night. The blanket was pushed to the right, the pillow askew, but there was no intense disarray. This led initial investigators to speculate that if Ava had left the room or been taken from it, it was highly likely she had been subdued quickly and silent. Near the window, one officer bent down, examining closely with a flashlight. The window frame was opened wider than Laura remembered. The sill had a thin layer of dust wiped away in a curved pattern, as if something or someone had leaned or slid across it. The wooden frame had a few small vertical scratches, not deep enough to conclude forced entry, but unusual enough to be noted in the report. Particularly, the lower edge of the window showed faint slide marks of movement from inside the room outward, creating a slight diagonal line, as if a heavy object had just been lifted over. Another officer stepped out onto the small exterior balcony and observed the parking lot below, noting a depression in the roadside dust directly under the window, not clear, but suggesting someone might have stood there the previous night. The investigators continued examining the entire bedroom, the position of Ava's toys, books, hanging clothes in the closet, the floor beside the bed. They looked for abnormalities at a microscopic level. Objects touched, distances between items changed, the arrangement of stuffed animals, anything that might indicate a second person had entered during the night. Though no official evidence was collected at this stage, as it was not yet determined what would be useful, they documented carefully for later analysis. After confirming the scene showed no signs of Ava leaving voluntarily, the officers proceeded to take Laura's initial statement. They asked about the time she tucked Ava in, any sounds heard during the night, Ava's daily habits, whether the bedroom door was locked, who could access the apartment at night. Laura said she heard no loud noises, saw no open living room window, and had no visitors the previous evening. Ava did not usually go out alone, and had never left the apartment without her mother. They also asked Laura about people close to the family, neighbors, co-workers, anyone who had contact with Ava. This list was recorded for deeper interviews later, but in the initial investigation, the goal was only to identify who last saw Ava besides her mother. Laura confirmed no one else had seen Ava since the previous evening. This helped police establish the clear last point Ava was present, when Laura closed the door. Next, police knocked on nearby apartments, collecting basic statements from residents. A few reported hearing faint noises in the hallway, but nothing clear. Another said they saw the shadow of a vehicle driving slowly through the parking lot late at night, but could not confirm the type or license plate. These notes were not enough to conclude anything but were included in the initial report, as potential leads for further investigation. As the final notes were completed, the officers outlined areas for immediate external check. The initial goal was to determine possible escape routes, if the perpetrator had taken Ava out through the window. The parking lot, grassy courtyard, and rear entrances of the complex were marked to begin an expanded search. No one said it aloud, but a silent tension spread through the investigation team. The first minutes are always the most critical, and in Brunswick that morning, all signs pointed to an abduction having occurred, and time was passing very quickly. The forces at the scene expanded their operations immediately after completing documentation in Ava's bedroom, shifting focus to the exterior areas of Turner Court, the courtyard below, the old parking lot, and the land running along the side of the apartment complex became priority zones, as they all lay in feasible directions. An intruder could have chosen to leave the room undetected. The K9 unit was brought in, approaching from the position below Ava's window. The dogs picked up the scent and began moving in formation, leading the team across the narrow grassy area between the two apartment rows. The officers' observations focused on areas where grass was pressed low or soil surfaces showed light disturbance. A strip of grass compressed into a long trail from the windowsill toward the parking lot was noted by the group as the likely primary route the perpetrator may have used to drag or carry Ava. The trail extended to the edge of the parking lot where old concrete patches mixed with dirt and loose gravel. The K9s reacted more strongly as they neared the rear corner of the complex, an area rarely used by residents and often shrouded in darkness at night. Officers used flashlights to scan each patch of ground, searching for surface changes, details that might indicate unusual movement the previous night. A small bright-colored object appeared amid the mixed soil, spotted thanks to a faint reflection as the sun rose higher. The forensics team was called to collect it under standard sealing procedures to avoid contaminating the scene. Though not yet confirmed as belonging to Ava, its shape and location were enough to add it to the list of leads for later comparison. The K9s led the team farther from the parking lot, gradually toward a dirt path into a sparse wooded area behind the complex. The air here was cooler, light dimmer, and the soft ground held more potential information. Faint tire impressions appeared beside low bushes, lying directly in the trajectory the canines were guiding the team toward. The tire marks were not clear enough to identify the vehicle type, but suggested a small car had stopped or turned into the area recently. The command team marked this point as a reference for the perpetrator's likely next movement. While examining the surrounding area of the tire marks, officers noted soil lightly churned in a pattern suggesting disturbance by a heavy object or footwear, reinforcing the possibility of quick, discrete activity there at night. Based on this, they divided the expanded search area into clear grids, extending deeper along the dirt path into the sparse woods. The search teams continued scanning in parallel lines. Each movement was controlled to avoid missing any signs related to the perpetrators. Several ground areas showed faint drag marks, some exposing damper soil beneath, indicating something or someone may have been pulled through recently. These observations were added to a temporary map to aid in determining the final direction. One group on the left flank of the search line encountered another small item, similar in color and size to children's belongings. It was immediately sealed and added to the evidence list for testing. The team made no conclusions at this point, but the canine direction combined with the matching item locations made the sparse woods the main focus. The area was secured with plastic stakes and marking tape in preparation for the next expanded search phase. The canine unit continued probing deeper, while officers created a preliminary map, guiding the entire team. From Ava's window down to the grass, through the parking lot, then into the dirt path and sparse woods, all formed a logical chain in terms of terrain. This direction helped the team define a larger search perimeter, including the adjoining undeveloped land beyond. The final groups emerged from the sparse woods, with full notes and markers, transferring all information to the scene command team. What was gathered in this phase still could not form a complete picture, but it clearly pointed to a path the perpetrator may have chosen to remove Ava from the apartment unseen. A broader search perimeter was gradually taking shape, and the focus of the pursuit now shifted to farther areas where the terrain opened up and held greater potential for critical traces of this missing person case. The search teams continued to expand the search area toward the sparse forest beyond the apartment complex, and as the forces dispersed into lines to sweep the vast terrain, one group of volunteers along with 2 officers ventured deeper into the high grass section near the boundary leading toward the Okefenokee swamp. This area was desolate, rarely visited by anyone, with uneven ground, grass growing above the knees, and patches of brush intertwined, making movement even more difficult. The officers had to use sticks to clear a path, marking the way back as they went. The air here was more humid, and the light was dimmer due to the thick canopy. As the group was advancing through a small flat clearing between 2 bushes, one volunteer suddenly stopped short upon spotting a small figure lying motionless on the sandy soil. The first instinct was to call out loudly to the nearby officers. As they approached closer, a sudden silence fell over the group. A tiny body, covered in dirt and mud, lay on its side among the dry grass blades. No one dared to make a hasty guess, but everyone understood that they had just found what everyone had feared from the start of the search. The officers approached cautiously, checking for signs of life without altering the body's position on the ground. Their eyes quickly shifted between the pale skin tone, patches of soil stuck to the belly and arms, and the clear bruising on the exposed skin area. One of the officers placed a hand near the area under the nose to check for breathing, and realized that Ava still had signs of life, though very faint. The reaction was almost immediate, requesting the radio to call for medical personnel with the highest emergency signal. While waiting for medical staff, the surrounding area was cordoned off with marking tapes, creating a safety radius to preserve the scene. The officers only moved within the minimal range, avoiding touching anything around Ava's body. The position where the child lay, the condition of dirt on her clothes, the soil stuck under her arms, and the bruise marks on her skin, all became important data for later scene analysis. Medical personnel arrived with emergency kits, checking pulse, breathing, and Ava's response. After an initial assessment, they transferred her onto a soft stretcher to minimize impact on the body. Before leaving the scene, the technical team quickly took photos from several angles around Ava's position to ensure an initial record of the scene state. Before the victim was moved for emergency treatment, Ava was loaded onto a medical helicopter and transported directly to the nearest hospital in Brunswick. As the helicopter departed the wilderness, the crime scene technical team began conducting a perimeter check around where Ava had been lying. Samples of soil, gravel, grass, and disturbed mud patches were carefully collected using specialized tools, each sample sealed immediately after collection. Small objects scattered around were also added to the list for testing, though none could yet be confirmed as directly related. The ground area where Ava's body had made contact was documented for shape, length, lying direction, and auxiliary impressions for later reconstruction. At the hospital, Ava was admitted to the emergency department, where the medical team received her in critical condition. Doctors quickly treated the injuries and assessed the immediate dangers. In addition to treatment activities, a forensic medical examiner was called in to coordinate with the treatment team to document traces on Ava's body according to proper forensic medical exam procedures. Bruises, scratches, stretched skin areas, and soil streaks in patches were all recorded and photographed. This was very important as it could help determine how the victim was moved, the time spent on the ground, and the type of environment she was exposed to during the missing period. Ava's clothing was carefully removed and transferred directly to the evidence collection table. Each layer of fabric was examined under specialized lights for foreign fibers, scratch marks, or materials adhered from another environment. The forensic team collected fibers that did not match the color, soil particles deep in the fabric layers, as well as inconsistent dust patches compared to the soil where Ava was found. All were sealed in separate containers, coated, and sent to the analysis lab. Ava's hair contained many small granular soil particles, some of which had different color and fineness from the soil where Ava was found. This was a potential clue, suggesting the child may have been at another location before being left in the wilderness. These hair samples were cut into sections and divided into multiple test samples for later soil comparison analysis. Doctors also documented the shape of bruises and injuries on Ava's body according to forensic standards, including width, direction, and depth of the marks. Initial results indicated multiple types of force impact, suggesting Ava had undergone movement or dragging before being placed on the ground where she was found. When Ava was transferred to a stabilization treatment room, all collected evidence was handed over to the investigation unit to compile the initial case file. This evidence chain included soil samples, fiber samples, small fragments, scene photos, and all of Ava's clothing. This was the foundational information layer that investigators would rely on in the coming days to determine a clearer investigation direction, particularly tracing the location where Ava may have been taken before being abandoned in the wilderness near Okefenokee Swamp. The first hours after emergency treatment were considered the most critical for doctors to assess Ava's recovery potential, and as vital signs gradually stabilized, the investigation team was allowed to approach the child under strict medical team supervision. Direct questioning was not possible, as Ava's voice could barely produce any sound. Each attempt to open her mouth only resulted in labored breathing, sometimes accompanied by slight trembling from pain. The doctor suggested she communicate on paper, a safe method that placed no pressure on her exhausted body. A blank sheet of paper and a pencil were placed on the small table beside the bed. Ava extended her hand very slowly, as if each movement pulled along a wave of pain. Nevertheless, the small hand grasped the pencil with a focus that made the entire room fall even quieter. Ava looked up at the investigator, her eyes still clouded with fatigue, but not lacking an unusual alertness, then began writing the first line. The writing was not neat, with some scribbled strokes but clear enough to read. Ava described the man she encountered that night. She wrote about dark hair, somewhat matted as if unwashed for many days, and a face with oily skin that made his image unforgettable. Small details like the width of the forehead, slightly drooping eyebrows, and chin shape were recorded by Ava bit by bit. The investigators noted that the child's observational ability far exceeded expectations for an 8-year-old who had just survived a life-threatening ordeal. When given a new sheet, Ava continued describing his build. Not too tall but with broad shoulders. She pointed to her own arm to express through gestures, then wrote a few more words to convey the roughness of the perpetrator's hands when carrying her from the bed. These descriptions helped the investigation team begin shaping the physical profile of the attacker, though still very preliminary. The investigator gently shifted to questions about the vehicle. Ava took a long pause before putting pen to paper. Perhaps the memory of the car was tied to great fear, or her small body was struggling with post-surgery fatigue. But then the strokes appeared again. She described the car having old seats, with leather torn in a diagonal line, the interior color darker than the light shining from outside during nighttime movement. She added that the car had a very strong cigarette smell, enough to make her feel short of breath at the time. This detail prompted investigators to note the possibility that the perpetrator was a heavy smoker or frequently used the car in enclosed environments. Ava described the front of the car more basically, only writing that it looked smaller than Mom's car, suggesting a sedan or compact type, not a truck or SUV. Such information was hard to pinpoint the exact vehicle immediately, but it was an important step to narrow the comparison range later. Another sheet was provided to ask about the route, whether Ava remembered places the perpetrator had taken her through. Though just a child traveling at night, Ava remembered better than adults expected. She wrote about a road section with tall trees on both sides, and at times the car passed areas with brighter lights, like near a school or public building. Investigators immediately recalled several areas around the apartment with similar features: an elementary school, a community center, and a large bus station. This information could not yet be confirmed, but it was very useful for mapping the initial route. Ava also wrote that the car stopped once in a very quiet place, with no sound of other vehicles, and no surrounding lights. This could mean the perpetrator had taken her to a sparse forest or wilderness area before abandoning her at the discovered location. This note aligned with what the scene team observed during soil sample collection. The soil environment where Ava was found did not fully match the soil adhered to her clothes, suggesting she had been in another location before. Through many sheets of paper, Ava provided the first raw material for the entire investigation: description of the perpetrator, description of the vehicle, surrounding environmental signs, and part of the. Each childish stroke was an important puzzle piece, not only from the emotional survival perspective, but also as real data with legal value. When Ava became too tired to continue writing, the investigator collected all the papers into a sealed envelope. These notes were quickly divided into two categories: portrait description data and spatial description data. This would serve as the basis for sketching the suspect in the next phase, and for beginning to match with local maps to determine a more accurate possible route. Ava's initial statement, though written in trembling strokes on white paper, became the most valuable information the investigation team had at that point, and it was also the first time they had hope of shaping a clearer pursuit direction in the rapidly unfolding case. The pages Ava left behind became the focus of a quick meeting at the hospital between the investigation team and GBI representatives. As soon as the statement was handed over, they agreed that the next step must be sketching a portrait based on the victim's description. An experienced sketch artist in child assault cases was called in, bringing drawing tools and standard feature description boards for reconstructing facial characteristics. Ava was still weak, but she showed remarkable patience as the artist began the process. Without direct verbal questions, the artist presented feature boards for Ava to point or write additional notes: eyebrow shape, eyelid curve, distance between eyes, nose shape, chin width. Each time the artist sketched a line, Ava would nod or shake her head lightly, sometimes writing short words to adjust details. Gradually, scattered features were pieced together into the face of a man that even adult victims would struggle to describe so accurately. When the completed sketch was erected on a large sheet, investigators observed consistency with Ava's prior description. Not too tall build, rather angular face, matted black hair and slightly drooping eyes, giving a tired or gloomy impression. The face in the sketch was not the type that easily blended into a crowd, yet had distinct enough features to compare with individuals who had lived around Brunswick at that time. The sketch was quickly copied into multiple versions and distributed to each investigation group handling different areas. The Brunswick Police Department began reviewing resident records around Turner Court. From the late 19th, officers went door to door in apartments near Turner Court, showing the sketch to residents and asking if they had seen this man in the area. Most responses were head shakes, but a few said the figure was not unfamiliar, though they couldn't specify. Comparison with local subjects was expanded to the list of individuals with minor prior convictions in the Brunswick area. Not all petty criminals were dangerous, but in child assault cases, perpetrators sometimes emerged from records of warnings for loitering or unauthorized entry. The sketch was entered into the internal system, matched against old file photos. No one matched perfectly, though a few had some similarities. Another group focused on checking vehicles matching Ava's written description. Investigators scanned lists of owners of small cars, sedans or compacts, living near the apartment or who had lived in the area around night. The initial list was quite long since small cars were common in low-income residential areas. To narrow it down, the team relied on interior descriptions. Torn seats on the right side or front seat back, dark interior color, and possible strong cigarette smell. Some owners were called in for checks, but no vehicle matched fully. A few had once had torn interiors, but replaced them. Some had cigarette smells but not matching the seat tier position, Ava described. Another investigation branch concentrated on movement activity on the night of the disappearance, or prior day. Brunswick was not a large city, but people coming and going in apartment areas were often noticed. Investigators visited neighboring residential areas asking about strange vehicles at night. A few witnesses vaguely remembered a light-colored car driving slowly at night, but when asked for more details on license plates or driver's appearance, memories were faint. There were no security cameras in the complex in 1990, making this investigation step even harder. Meanwhile, some investigators checked lists of people with names similar to what Ava had written. The child only wrote a few short letters, not entirely certain, but enough for the team to compile a list of men with matching or similarly pronounced names within many miles around Brunswick. This list was quickly narrowed by age and appearance to find matches with the sketch. However, through many file photos and ID images, none matched enough to be considered a primary suspect. The results of Round 1 investigation, though not identifying a specific suspect, still provided an important benefit, determining the perpetrator's behavior according to the initial pattern. Based on clues Ava provided, investigators began envisioning the type of person they were facing: an active individual, capable of surveilling the apartment complex beforehand, knowing to choose quiet times, and a means to move quickly at night. Details about the car interior and cigarette smell suggested this man spent much time in the vehicle, tended to travel frequently, or used the car as temporary shelter. The sketch also showed the perpetrator made no effort to conceal his face when approaching the victim. This led the team to hypothesize he was not worried about identification because he either did not live in the area or did not appear frequently in Brunswick, reducing the chance of witness recognition. These pieces, though loose, created new reasoning directions for later development. The first investigation round closed with many unanswered questions. No one matched the sketch, no vehicle fully matched the description, and no direct witness saw Ava being taken. However, the investigation team now had an important data set: perpetrator characteristics, vehicle type, possible route passed, and preliminary behavior model. This was the foundation for preparing to enter the next phase, the phase that could decide whether this case would progress or fall into a prolonged deadlock. The results from the initial round of investigation were quickly compiled in internal meetings, and although the investigative team had diligently scrutinized every clue Ava provided, the harsh truth gradually became clear. None of the data came close to identifying the attacker's identity. The composite sketch was circulated internally among law enforcement agencies in Brunswick and surrounding areas, but no one was recorded as having an appearance similar enough to become a primary suspect. Faces that resembled it vaguely were all ruled out after direct checks or cross-referencing with residency records. The physical evidence collected at the abandoned lot crime scene, and from Ava's body, was sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Laboratory for analysis. However, investigations in 1990 faced the limitations of the technology available at the time. Forensic DNA existed, but the comparison database was extremely small, covering only individuals arrested for certain types of crimes. The majority of the population had no DNA records, and the samples obtained from Ava's clothing and skin could only be tested to confirm their presence, but could not be linked to any specific individual. The results confirmed the presence of male epithelial cells, some fabric fibers that did not match the color of Ava's clothing, and soil with mineral composition different from the location where she was found. This data was valuable for describing the context, but had no ability to point to the perpetrator's identity. There were no clear fingerprints in the bedroom or on items collected in the wooded area. Shoe prints, or drag marks outside the apartment, were blurred due to weather and the unstable sandy surface. Each piece of evidence, when analyzed, pointed to the same conclusion. It was not strong enough to identify the offender. Regarding the vehicle, even though Ava had described the interior relatively clearly, the number of matching cars was too large. Vehicles with torn seats, dark interiors, and a strong cigarette smell were common features in hundreds of older cars in the Brunswick area at that time. The investigative team checked many owners with histories of nighttime travel, but each time they hit a dead end, due to lack of direct linking evidence. No vehicle matched Ava's description perfectly enough to warrant suspicion. Efforts to collect statements in the residential area also yielded no breakthroughs. Witnesses who had reported seeing a car driving slowly through the apartment complex that night could not recall the license plate, were unsure of the make, and mostly provided only fragmented memory. No one saw Ava being let out, and no one identified any man with clearly suspicious behavior during the time of the incident. Some residents even admitted they slept deeply through the night and heard no unusual sound. From the investigators' perspective, the biggest missing piece was the connection between the location where Ava was taken and where she was found. Although the soil samples on her body suggested she might have been at another site before being abandoned, this information was not sufficient to pinpoint a specific location. There was no evidence indicating how long Ava was held at the initial site, or how far the perpetrator traveled before leaving her. There were no surveillance cameras at that time, and the outskirts of Brunswick were sparsely populated, making the chance of witnesses nearly zero. In the following weeks, Ava's case file was passed to various investigators, each trying to reanalyze the scene in their own way, but always circling back to the same issue. Everything they had was hard to verify. Leads built from Ava's descriptions occasionally sparked hope, but upon thorough checking, they all led to dead ends. Even more concerning was that the attacker appeared to leave no pattern of repeated behavior in Brunswick shortly afterward, making it difficult to trace back through behavioral patterns. Not long after, the investigation began to lose momentum. Officers were reassigned to other cases, and Ava's file was placed in the storage for unsolved cases. All the initial leads, though fully documented, remained dormant in the thick case file, awaiting an opportunity to be revisited with new development. There was no sign the perpetrator would repeat the behavior, no additional information from the community, and no new technology powerful enough to dissect the existing evidence. The case gradually became a heavy burden in the memories of the investigative team, not because it was forgotten, but because every avenue closed too early. Ava Turner's name continued to appear in weekly meetings, as a reminder of a case that could not be allowed to fade into oblivion. But without sufficient evidence, no suitable suspect, and no legal basis for deeper pursuit, the file had to be paused in an unresolved state. That was when the case officially entered the status every investigator dreads, a complete deadlock, not due to lack of effort, but due to lack of trails to follow. The Ava Turner kidnapping and assault from the summer night in 1990 fell into silence. The silence of an unsolved case, shrouded in too many gaps, awaiting an opportunity that no one could be sure would ever come. Weeks continued to pass after the case hit a deadlock, and although the investigative team kept Ava Turner's file on the priority monitoring list, the harsh reality of 1990 limited every effort beyond overcoming barriers. When no new leads emerged, the file began to be considered under the process for handling cases that could not be solved in the short term. At that point, the Brunswick Police Department had to classify Ava's case as an unsolved missing person and assault with unidentified perpetrator, a step no one wanted but one that had become necessary. The process of transferring a case to unsolved status was not simply closing the file and putting it away. All related data had to be reviewed one final time, including full scene reports, Ava's written statements, the composite sketch, photographs of injuries, soil samples collected from the wooded area, and small evidence items found around the abandoned lot. Each piece of evidence needed to be resealed according to 1990s storage standards, which were not as sophisticated as modern systems, but still strict regarding control of humidity, temperature, and prevention of cross-contamination. The GBI technical team took responsibility for receiving the samples from Brunswick PD. In the evidence room, each plastic bag and small box containing fabric fibers, soil, debris, and Ava's clothing was assigned a permanent code, labeled under the long-term evidence coding system. Samples with potential DNA, though not fully analyzable at the time, were placed in cold storage to minimize degradation over time. Investigators looking at these evidence bags understood that they might hold the answer in the future if technology advanced further. The suspect composite sketch was also placed in the file archive, among hundreds of sketches from other unsolved cases. The pencil lines describing the face of the man Ava saw became one of the most important clues, yet also one of the least valuable in the circumstances of the time, when there was no one to compare it accurately against. The face in the drawing was seen as representing an elusive perpetrator, one who left no fingerprints, was not clearly seen by anyone, and had no matching record in the system. In the final review meeting with Brunswick PD, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation representative had to frankly assess the Ava Turner case was a difficult one to solve, not due to lack of effort, but due to lack of tool. At that time, forensic technology was still developing. DNA analysis was highly limited, and resident data retrieval was not unified statewide. Law enforcement agencies relied mainly on witnesses, paper record comparisons, and investigative intuition. With a cautious perpetrator who moved quickly at night and left no clear traces, the chance of identifying him was nearly zero. Additionally, Brunswick was a small town with limited investigative resources. When no new leads appeared, officers had to redirect manpower to other urgent cases. Ava's case remained in the memory of many, but the official file lay dormant in storage, marked as unsolved, awaiting reactivation with technological advances or an unexpected witness. Nevertheless, the decision to transfer the file to cold case status did not mean the case was completely forgotten. GBI kept a full copy of all data, and whenever a new case with similar patterns occurred, they would pull Ava's file for comparison. Many officers involved in the 1990 case still felt lingering regret, but there was nothing more they could do at the time. Forensic technology was not yet strong enough to analyze very small samples. The national DNA database was incomplete, and there was no repeat offense to expand the search for the perpetrator. And so the Ava Turner case, which had once alarmed the entire Brunswick community, gradually sank into the silence of cases with no further path. The evidence remained in GBI storage containers, inside climate-controlled rooms, away from sunlight and out of reach of anyone without authorization. The paper file system was also carefully stored, each page stamped according to long-term preservation procedure. That silence lasted year after year. A case that had once been active and full of information became a dormant file in storage, awaiting a change in time or technology to create an opportunity for review. But in 1990, that was still beyond everyone's reach. The only reality then, the Ava Turner case had officially entered cold case status, like many other unsolved cases, and no one knew when that circle of silence would be broken. Ava Turner's file remained in GBI's cold case storage for many years, until a major overhaul in violent crime investigations across Georgia began implementation in the late. Powerful advances in forensic DNA, combined with increased federal funding for processing unsolved cases, opened rare opportunities for agencies to revisit files once thought impossible to advance. In 2009, Georgia officially launched a statewide cold case reevaluation program, focusing on cases with preserved biological evidence, and those involving surviving victims who could provide valuable information. Among the hundreds of files reviewed, Ava Turner's case quickly caught the attention of the expert team. The thick file containing a young victim's written statements, a clear composite sketch, and a diverse array of carefully preserved biological evidence, all made it a highly promising case when viewed through. Unlike many cases with only scattered data fragments, Ava's had a relatively complete structure, meticulously documented scenes, detailed but underexploited statements, and biological samples that could be re-extracted using new methods. This interest led to the official decision to include Ava Turner's file in the first wave of cases for re-evaluation. Brunswick PD was notified and transferred all original evidence back to GBI for reanalysis from scratch. The evidence bags sealed in 1990 fabric fibers on Ava's clothing, soil caught in her hair, skin tissue samples her clothes were now taken to a laboratory with equipment far more advanced than 3 decades earlier. At the same time, GBI assigned a new investigator to the case, Detective Cole Whitaker. He was one of the experienced detectives in solving complex violent assault cases, and particularly skilled at reconstructing scenes by piecing together small details. Whitaker had never heard of the Ava case before receiving the file, but upon opening the time-worn documents, he soon realized This was no ordinary case. Ava's persistence in providing statements while in critical condition, along with the numerous details she remembered and conveyed, showed this was a case where the victim had fought to be heard, and failed only due to technological barriers of the time. Whitaker spent the first days rereading all of Ava's written statements, observing each immature but firm stroke of handwriting, then cross-referencing with the composite sketch created shortly after. He carefully reviewed scene reports, victim recovery diagrams, photos of the abandoned lot, and lingered over the description of the vehicle Ava recalled. Details about the torn interior, cigarette smell and dark space inside all suggested to him that the perpetrator might spend a lot of time in the vehicle, perhaps even viewing it as his primary operating space. While Whitaker handled the paper file, GBI began the reanalysis process for the evidence. Each sample was unsealed under strict supervision, photographed and recoded to new standards. With STR and mini-STR technology, DNA samples previously too weak or contaminated now had a chance to be isolated and analyzed. The lab also prepared TOTUS matching procedures, the national system now vastly larger than in 1990, with millions of DNA profiles from individuals arrested or convicted of serious crimes. Whitaker was well aware that reopening an old file was not just a technical act, but an opportunity to deliver justice to a case left behind by time. He paid special attention to the route Ava described that the perpetrator took, something an 8-year-old child would not easily remember, unless those points left a strong impression. Whitaker retrieved 1990 Brunswick maps from local archives, spread them across his desk, marked areas matching Ava's description, and began considering routes the perpetrator might have taken based on actual connection. A sense of a missing link began to form in Whitaker's mind. Perhaps the case wasn't solved in 1990, not due to lack of data, but because the data hadn't been placed in the right position. Or perhaps the technology and database scale at the time weren't sufficient to fully exploit the evidence potential. Whatever the reason, the reopening of the case showed one thing: it was time for the Ava Turner case to no longer be just a file in the dark. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, pieces of information once deemed insufficient were being brought into the light, and this time they had the potential to lead investigators to where the 1990 investigation could not reach. At the same time, Whitaker was sitting in front of an old Brunswick map, piecing together what Ava had once written. In another building dozens of miles away, the GBI technical team began a process no less critical: reopening evidence bags that had sat undisturbed for nearly 20 years. The white plastic boxes, labeled from 1990, were pulled from cold storage and placed on tables in a lab far more modern than anything available in the early days of the case. On each box label was the case number, the name Ava Turner, and a brief note, "Suspect unidentified, long-term storage." The technicians examined each bag under sterile conditions. The clothes Ava was wearing when she was found were laid out on a glass table, the fabric faded and worn, but still holding the same folds and stains documented years earlier. In 1990, most of those stains had only been described and photographed. Deeper analysis was limited by the equipment available. In 2009, every patch of dried mud on the hem, every loose thread, became a potential source of information. A technician used a digital microscope to examine the fabric surface. Interwoven among the original fibers were many smaller ones of different colors and structures, unlike the rest of the clothing, possibly from a car seat, the perpetrator's clothes, or another surface Ava had come into contact with. These fibers were carefully removed with specialized tweezers, placed on slides and individually coated. In 1990 they had simply been collected and classified as unidentified, but now each one could be analyzed for composition, compared to fabric databases, and most importantly, might contain trace biological material. The soil and mud stains on the clothing were also re-examined. Soil samples collected from the vacant lot where Ava was found had once been superficially compared to soil from other areas, mostly by eye. This time, the samples were sent to the Forensic Geology Unit. Mineral composition, pH, clay particles, sand, and even internal microstructures were tested using spectrometry and electron microscopy. One goal was to determine whether the soil on the clothing differed from soil taken directly from the discovery site, a detail that could support the theory that the girl had been at least 2 different locations the night she was attacked. Biological samples were the top priority. Small tubes containing epithelial cells, Blood samples and fluids mixed with wounds, sealed and frozen since 1990, were removed and thawed under strictly controlled temperature protocol. Current STR, mini-STR, and DNA signal enhancement technologies allowed analysts to work with extremely small or heavily contaminated samples, something the old lab could never do. Each sample was pipetted onto test plates, run through modern extraction chemicals, and fed into automated analyzers. Some samples previously marked unusable in old reports suddenly became central. Traces too faint on the inner surface of the shirt, less exposed to environmental degradation, had preserved minimal DNA. The analyzers began returning faint but far clearer signal peaks than the nearly flat graphs of years past. This was data early 1990s analysts could not extract. But with new technology, they now had a chance to assemble a DNA profile suitable for TOTA. The atmosphere in the lab was quiet yet tense. Everyone understood these items had survived 20 years in cold storage, not to be overlooked again. Every result, whether confirming a degraded sample or yielding a full DNA signal, was documented with meticulous care. Nearby, a reprinted composite sketch of the suspect was pinned to a board as a reminder that behind the numbers and graphs was a specific individual, the man who had evaded justice for 2 decades. The reanalysis did not happen in a day or a week. Each batch of samples required processing time, cross-checking, and internal validation before being considered reliable enough for the national database. Some still returned negative or 2-weak signals and were again classified unused, but others produced dramatically different results, clear, repeatable DNA peaks that allowed construction of a complete male genetic profile. That was the biggest difference between 1990 and 2009. Where once there were only notes about unidentified male cells, there was now a full DNA profile that could be uploaded to CODIS and compared against millions of others. Soil particles, fabric fibers, and biological samples, once nearly useless, had become the center of new hope. Each piece of data was encoded, cross-checked and prepared for the next step, the one that might finally answer the question Brunswick had left open for nearly 20 years. Who was the man in the sketch Ava described? The first DNA signals emerging in the lab coincided with Detective Cole Whitaker refocusing on the only detailed information from 1990 that remained intact. The words Ava wrote about the journey she endured the night she was abducted. Whitaker spread a full Brunswick map from the year of the crime across his desk, placed every note describing locations Ava remembered, and marked the 2 key points: the apartment where she was taken, and the vacant lot near Okefenokee Swamp where she was found. Though Ava was only an 8-year-old child that night, her memory contained distinctive spatial cues. She remembered a stretch of road lined with tall trees on both sides, bright lights at one point like a school or public building, the car stopping in a quiet place with no other traffic, and most of the drive being dark stretches with almost no house light. Those details could not stand alone, but together they formed a very specific movement pattern. Whitaker started by drawing the routes leaving Turner Court in night. Based on the road system at the time, there were roughly 3 main options to reach the outskirts of Brunswick. He noted that one passed an elementary school, matching Ava's description. Another ran along a section with tall trees on both shoulders. The third went through a densely populated residential area and did not fit her account of quiet for most of the trip. That immediately eliminated one. Of the 2 remaining, the area near the elementary school and community center would stand out to a terrified child: bright lights, more open space compared to the dark stretch. Whitaker circled that cluster of locations and cross-referenced it with old streetlight maps he located in local archives. A match appeared. A row of high-wattage lights had indeed been installed right between those areas in the late. This strengthened the likelihood that Ava saw light from that zone while being driven past. Next, Whitaker studied the area the 1990 K9 units had led search teams to. Though the original trail was not clear enough to map the full route, its direction aligned with the road heading towards sparse woods and vacant land. The zone bordering the edge of Okefenokee. This suggested the perpetrator avoided main roads and chose a dimly lit secondary route, consistent with Ava's description of long dark stretches. From the 2 endpoints, the apartment and the vacant lot, Whitaker outlined a broad triangular zone of highest probable perpetrator activity. He overlaid multiple maps, roads, streetlights, forest and vacant land, and finally residential patterns from. When analyzing the residency layer, He paid special attention to clusters of people who moved in and out over short periods, because if the perpetrator was not a permanent Brunswick resident, he might have come from another town and returned there afterward. What caught Whitaker's eye was a residential pattern extending southwest toward Waycross, Georgia. Many workers from Waycross had temporary jobs around Brunswick during that era, especially on projects along the connecting route. Older records showed considerable small vehicle traffic between the two towns, including types matching Ava's description. Though not direct evidence, this was the first time he saw repetition between her statement and geographic factor. On the temporary residency map, several rental properties on the outskirts of Waycross stood out for high turnover. Whitaker marked those areas as places the perpetrator might have lived, worked, or stayed briefly. To him, the Brunswick-Waycross connection was more than lines on a map. It was the movement pattern most consistent with someone who wanted to act quietly and then disappear from the area immediately afterward. As he finished the initial sketch of the travel route, Whitaker knew he was still only building a foundation, but that foundation was far beyond what the 1990 team had. Instead of scattered hypotheses, he now had a system grounded in geography, victim statement, and perpetrator route selection. From here he was ready for the critical next step, using the newly analyzed DNA to see if the model he built could lead to a specific identity. As the evidence reanalysis gradually produced an initial DNA dataset, Detective Cole Whitaker decided every sample from the case had to be given top priority. Reconstructing the perpetrator's route only had value when paired with real biological evidence. Without a complete DNA profile, everything remained theoretical. When the lab confirmed enough male DNA signals to rerun analysis, Whitaker immediately requested all samples be rushed through the GBI lab, and also arranged for portions to be sent to the FBI for more advanced processing. The evidence bags were repackaged to modern transport standards, accompanied by original 1990 collection records and notes from the recent reanalysis. Notably, some samples once labeled degraded or insufficient biological material were now included, thanks to low copy number (LCN) technology that could analyze DNA from only a handful of remaining cells. As a technician sealed the shipping container, he stressed that the least promising samples from 1990 sometimes became the key to a cold case because new equipment could exploit them in entirely different ways. At the GBI lab, experts began running tests using mini-esoteric technique. This method analyzes shorter DNA strands, ideal for degraded, contaminated, or time-damaged samples. Machines processed each sample through amplification cycles, filtering weak signals and boosting usable segment. The analyzers produced charts with DNA peaks appearing more regularly than in the initial runs, gradually revealing the male sample's genetic structure. The most difficult samples, including soil stuck in Ava's hair and small fabric patches inside the shirt, were forwarded to the FBI under special cold case assistance protocols. There the lab used LCN combined with next-generation contaminant filtering to separate human DNA from environmental DNA. This was a capability the 1990 Brunswick PD never had access to. Each time the machine successfully isolated a clear DNA segment, technicians noted it for cross-sample comparison to confirm whether traces came from one source or multiple contributors. Whitaker closely tracked progress, awaiting each interim report, as if it were the final puzzle piece. Whenever the lab reported a sample strong enough for CODIS entry, he marked it on his timeline board. Samples that once only confirmed presence of male cells now showed distinct identifiable peaks, signs a full DNA profile was taking shape. When GBI announced the genetic profile had enough markers for CODIS upload, Whitaker knew he was closer than ever to identifying the man Ava described. The profile 13 loci, the national standard, was submitted along with 2 additional FBI samples for verification. Once entered, it would automatically compare against millions of DNA records nationwide from arrestees, convicts, and unsolved case samples. At the CODIS data center, the perpetrator's profile entered the analysis queue. The system began running matching algorithms against existing profiles, generating locus-by-locus comparisons. Whenever software flagged even a partial match, it was tagged for manual forensic review. Most cold cases do not match immediately, sometimes taking weeks or months. But Whitaker remained patient. This was the moment he believed the case had waited nearly 2 decades to reach. While waiting, Whitaker returned to his timeline and roadmap. Even without a DNA match yet, The logic between Ava's description and the route toward Waycross grew clearer. The emerging DNA data was only half the answer. The other half lay in the overlap of behavior and geography, and everything he had built was converging on a single pattern. Each day Whitaker checked updates from GBI and the FBI, waiting for CODIS to complete each comparison round. No one dared predict the outcome. Other cold cases sometimes took years for a match, and some never found answers. But with the Ava Turner case, everyone shared the same feeling. The reanalyzed evidence was too complete, the DNA signals too clear, and the victim's description too detailed for this profile to remain dormant. And so when CODIS reported a match, it was not just a lab result, it was the first sign that this case might finally step out of the shadow that had lasted nearly 2 decades. When the CODIS system completed its first round of comparisons, the GBI received a notification flagged as a potential match, the kind of alert that typically requires manual verification to confirm. But even before the results were opened, Whitaker could feel the tension in the room rise noticeably. The months of waiting, the seemingly futile analyses of old evidence samples, now converged on a single point. The DNA extracted from the 1990 evidence had matched a profile in the national database. When the official report was opened, the name that appeared first was Dennis Ray Barlow, a man with a criminal record in Arkansas for assaulting and abducting a woman. That offense had a pattern so similar that it immediately made the entire investigative team take him seriously as the prime suspect. The victim had been controlled with a knife, dragged into a car, driven to a remote location, and assaulted in a manner almost identical to Ava's account. Whitaker sat motionless for a few seconds, staring at the report. Not out of surprise, but because for the first time in nearly 20 years, a name had clearly appeared attached to the DNA that had once been unidentified. It was no longer guesswork or inference. This was absolute forensic data. Immediately he requested records of Barlow's residences during the time of the crime. The results drew his attention even more. Barlow had lived near Waycross, Georgia, just a short drive from Brunswick, and had worked temporarily on a construction site in the area from his presence within a reasonable travel radius at the time Ava was abducted not only matched Whitaker's earlier assumptions from the map, but also fit the come-and-go behavioral pattern he had constructed. Old documents showed that Barlow did not stay in Waycross long. He moved around various places over a few years, then disappeared from the area right after 1991, which coincided with the perpetrator not reoffending in Brunswick after Ava's case. This reinforced the suspicion that he may have only been in Brunswick for a short period, long enough to observe, select a target, and flee before police could establish a direction for the investigation. Whitaker continued comparing Barlow's personal records with the composite sketch Ava had provided in. When Barlow's driver's license photo from that year was brought in and placed next to the sketch, no one in the room needed more time to doubt. The dark hair, the drooping eye shape, the slightly tapered chin, and the weary expression were almost identical. If one didn't know these were two separate documents nearly 2 decades apart, it might seem the artist had used the photo as a model. Ava's sketch, created from the memory of an 8-year-old child in a few horrifying moments, turned out to be accurate to an almost absolute degree. Next came checking additional vehicle data. Barlow had owned a small dark-colored sedan in the late 1980s, with torn front seat upholstery, a detail that also appeared in the records of the car impounded when he was arrested. And the heavy cigarette smell was also noted in the arrest report from that time. What seemed like scattered information suddenly aligned into a perfectly logical sequence, matching Ava's account. Whitaker requested a review of all documents related to Barlow's workplaces and rentals near the time of the crime. A list of people who had known him was compiled, and all traffic data between Waycross and Brunswick from those years was examined for signs of travel coinciding with the timeline. Daily habits, places where he bought cigarettes, bars he frequented, everything was added to the growing comprehensive file. The general feeling in the investigative team was clear. They had found the man who had evaded them, a perpetrator with no DNA record at the time, no stable residence in Brunswick, and no clear witnesses left behind. It wasn't until he committed a crime in another state a few years later that his DNA was entered into the system, and that was what finally gave Ava's case its breakthrough. Barlow didn't just match the DNA, he matched the sketch, matched the vehicle description, matched the travel route, matched the behavior, and matched the timing of appearing and then disappearing from the area after the crime. Whitaker knew that from here, every next step would no longer be about searching for clues, but preparing to approach the suspect who had evaded capture for nearly 2 decades. Ava Turner's case had finally reached the moment every cold case investigator dreams of. The perpetrator's identity was no longer a question, but simply a matter of time before facing him directly. As soon as the initial data on Dennis Ray Barlow was confirmed, Whitaker knew the investigation could not stop at the DNA match. Genetic evidence allowed identification, but to bring a case dormant for nearly 2 decades back into the light of justice, he needed a full chain of evidence to charge him. Thus the entire team entered the next phase, verifying every piece of information about Barlow's past, residences, travel history, and behavior from 1980. From the collected residency records, Whitaker pinpointed where Barlow had lived near Waycross. It was a low-rent housing complex on the edge of town, intended for temporary workers in the area. Records showed Barlow had moved there for about 1.5 years, coinciding with his work on a mobile construction site in Brunswick. Many workers at the time commuted between the two areas, and Barlow was among them. Data from cigarette purchases at a local store in 1990 showed he had appeared multiple times in Brunswick, further strengthening a connection that no one had noticed for years. Whitaker sent 2 investigators to Waycross to check the old housing complex. The current owner was not the manager from 1990, but the archived records were well preserved. Tenant lists, room numbers, residency periods, and a few notes about residents from that era. Barlow's name appeared with a brief comment, quiet, little interaction, often came home late. Though not incriminating in itself, the often came home late detail prompted Whitaker to note it, as it matched the perpetrator's pattern of approaching Ava's apartment late at night. Next, the team examined Barlow's vehicles from that period. An old DMV document recorded that he owned a dark-colored sedan from the late 80s, with patched leather upholstery. When Whitaker compared this to Ava's description of torn seats and a dark interior, the similarity became hard to deny. Records also retained the report from the 1997 arrest, clearly stating the impounded car had tears in the front seats and a heavy cigarette smell. Details Ava had written down in the hospital, and the investigators continued tracking down anyone who had contact with Barlow while he lived in Waycross or worked in Brunswick. They followed the labor list from the 1989-1991 construction site and found a few people who had worked with him. When questioned, one recalled that Barlow always smoked and rarely left his car. Another said he often sat in his car for long periods after work, as if it suited him more than his rent. These statements not only matched Ava's description but also suggested a fixed behavioral pattern. The car was not just transportation but his familiar space. Another witness said Barlow had a habit of disappearing for a few hours at night, with no one knowing where he went. Though not strong legally, it once again fit the perpetrator's pattern, approaching the target when the apartment complex was quiet and avoiding lit or busy areas. Whitaker also researched Barlow's travel history through bills, purchase receipts, and remaining traffic records. A 1991 traffic citation recorded Barlow's car being stopped on the route connecting Waycross and Brunswick near midnight. That timing was about 1 year after Ava's case, but it confirmed he had a habit of traveling that exact road Whitaker had mapped as the perpetrator's. These seemingly minor details began connecting meaningfully. One of the most important pieces came from a woman who had lived near the rental complex in Waycross. She remembered a detail the team considered valuable. Barlow had appeared with a long scratch on his arm a few days before leaving the complex, saying it was an injury from work. Though it couldn't be proven related to Ava's case as the timing didn't fully overlap, Whitaker noted it in the file because perpetrators sometimes sustain injuries while subduing victims. When compiling all the newly gathered data, Whitaker looked at the analysis board and knew that every scattered piece about Barlow was falling into place. Suitable residence, reason to travel to Brunswick, matching vehicle type, similar nighttime behavior, and a reclusive lifestyle that made him hard to identify. Although the evidence still needed final DNA comparison, the details aligning with Ava's account created a clearer picture than ever before. This verification process not only strengthened the DNA match, it proved that Ava's entire description written in the hospital as an 8-year-old was not from hazy childhood memory, but an accurate reflection of what she had experienced. And with this level of alignment, Whitaker understood it was time to prepare for the next step, approaching and arresting the man who had escaped investigation for nearly 2 decades. The data collected in the second round of investigation was enough for Whitaker and the GBI to be confident that they not only had a matching DNA profile, but also a chain of behavioral, residency, and vehicle evidence fully consistent with Ava's night. When the comprehensive report was completed, Whitaker submitted the file to the prosecutor's office to obtain an official arrest warrant for Dennis Ray Barlow. The submitted file was so thorough that there was no room for doubt. Absolute DNA match, matching physical description, suitable route, similar vehicle, and multiple witness statements confirming characteristic behaviors. The warrant was signed shortly afterward. The GBI immediately developed an approach plan. According to the latest updated data, Barlow was working at a private garage not far from downtown Savannah. This was a job he had held for several years, and where he was typically present throughout the workday. Whitaker and the team decided to execute the arrest there, an open, controllable location, with less risk to the public compared to approaching his home. The next morning, the GBI convoy arrived at the garage. They used no sirens, avoiding unnecessary attention. The arrest team was divided into two groups, one approaching directly from the front, the other circling to the back to block escape routes. Once both groups confirmed positions, Whitaker signaled to move in. The investigators entered the garage, while employees were busy repairing vehicles or talking to customers. No one noticed them until Whitaker called out the suspect's name, Dennis Ray Barlow. Barlow turned around, his face calm for a moment. Then, seeing the array of agents approaching, that calm vanished quickly. He raised his hands, showing no resistance. The GBI immediately cuffed him, reading the arrest warrant clearly, ensuring no procedural gaps that could affect the case legally later. Those around were stunned. To them, Barlow was just an ordinary employee, quiet, unnoticeable, always keeping a low profile in daily work. After securing the suspect, the forensics team entered to search his personal work area in the garage under the accompanying search warrant. A metal locker containing personal items was opened. Inside were cigarette butts of the type described in the 1997 records, some old documents, and notably a rusty folding knife. The knife was not new enough to immediately link to the 1990 crime, but its shape and blade type matched the descriptions of wound patterns in the forensic medical exam. The knife was seized immediately and sealed for further analysis. Additionally, the team found an old jacket in a bin. The inner fabric color and texture closely resembled some fibers found on Ava's clothing. Though nothing could be confirmed on site, seizing the jacket became important evidence for comparison testing. Other items like old ID cards, documents related to his former residence in Waycross, and a few cigarette purchase receipts from his early time working in Georgia were also collected for analysis. While the forensics team continued gathering evidence, Barlow was escorted out of the garage and into the transport vehicle. His face showed little clear emotion, but his eyes seemed to avoid everything around him. The garage employees stood watching, confused by the unprecedented scene at their workplace. One even whispered that he was always quiet and unsuspicious, which made Whitaker even more convinced that Barlow had been highly successful at hiding his true self for many years. The transport went smoothly. As the GBI vehicle left the garage, Whitaker looked through the rear window, watching the building gradually fade from view. He knew this moment marked the most significant turning point since Ava Turner's case was reopened. Barlow was no longer just a name in a report or a face in a sketch. He was the official suspect in custody, preparing to enter interrogation and face the chain of evidence he could no longer evade. With the arrest completed and a series of new evidence collected, Ava Turner's case had finally moved to the phase Whitaker had awaited throughout the investigation: direct confrontation with the man who had concealed the truth for nearly 2 decades, and beginning to find answers for the gaps only the perpetrator could fill. Barlow was taken into the GBI interrogation room on the very day he was arrested. The room was small, with gray walls, a metal table, and 2 chairs facing each other. Nothing special, but it was the space where fragments of memories buried for nearly 2 decades would finally be uncovered. Whitaker entered first, carrying a thick file folder, which he placed on the table in a spot where Barlow could see it, but not reach it. The suspect's eyes glanced at it quickly before looking away, as if he knew exactly what was inside that folder. Whitaker started with basic questions: place of employment, residential history, old acquaintances, and the periods when he had lived in Georgia. Barlow answered monotonously, showing no emotion, his voice flat like someone trying to stay calm. But when Whitaker shifted to questions about 1990, specifically the months he had worked around Brunswick, Barlow had a clear reaction. His breathing slowed, his shoulders tensed slightly, and his eyes no longer avoided contact but became distant, as if gauging how much he should say. Whitaker was in no rush. He opened the file and placed in front of Barlow the suspect sketch provided by Ava that year. The sketch made by an 8-year-old child was placed next to his 19. Barlow stared at the two images for nearly 3 seconds, longer than any normal reaction. Then immediately turned his face away. Whitaker noted that response without saying a word. He continued with the question, "Did you ever drive through Turner Court in the summer of?" Barlow replied softly, "I don't remember." Whitaker pressed, "Did you ever own a dark-colored sedan with torn front seats?" Barlow was silent for a few seconds before answering, "Old cars break down." An evasive response that didn't match the question, and Whitaker knew he was flustered. When Whitaker presented the 1991 traffic citation, proving Barlow had driven on the route connecting Waycross to Brunswick at night, the suspect only clenched his hands together, saying nothing. No denial, but no explanation either. A dangerous silence for someone under investigation. When Whitaker opened the envelope containing the DNA report and placed it in front of Barlow, the atmosphere in the room immediately changed. Barlow could no longer hide his tension, his eyes fixed on the words, "Coitus match," then quickly looked away, as if seeing something he had tried to avoid for years. Whitaker didn't raise his voice or pressure him. He simply said, "This DNA was taken from the clothing of an 8-year-old girl and it matches you perfectly." Barlow didn't react immediately. He sat still, arms crossed as if shielding something. Whitaker continued discussing the evidence. Fabric fibers matching the jacket seized from the garage, soil samples matching the area where he had worked, and especially the description of the car: torn seats, dark interior, cigarette smell. Details that Ava had recorded without a single error. When asked why fibers identical to his jacket appeared on the victim's clothing, Barlow offered no reasonable explanation. When asked why his DNA was found on Ava's body, he said briefly, "I don't know, maybe a mistake." But this mistake was impossible with a DNA profile matching at all loci in the analysis. Whitaker let the silence linger for a few seconds, a pause more effective than any question. Barlow began shifting in his seat constantly, hands clenched into fists, shoulders twitching slightly. These were classic signs of someone who knew they had been backed into a corner with no escape. When another investigator entered with documents related to the 1997 assault in Arkansas, the case where Barlow had been arrested, he became even more flustered. The two cases were 7 years apart, but followed the same pattern. Approaching from behind, controlling with a knife, putting the victim in the car, choosing a secluded location. Those similarities were no longer coincidental. Barlow tried to say the 1997 case was a misunderstanding, but when asked why both victims described the attacker's behavior and words identically, he couldn't answer. His silence became evidence greater than any confession. At the end of the interrogation, Whitaker placed one final document in front of him. Ava's statement written while she was still in the hospital bed in childlike scribbled handwriting, but full of details. The last line Ava wrote, "He said his name was Den." Barlow stared at that line for a long time. He didn't nod, didn't utter a confession, but his entire body conveyed one thing. The denial was over. Every piece of data from 3 decades earlier statements, physical evidence, DNA, now converged and locked him in the grip of the law. In that moment, Whitaker knew the investigation had officially reached the point no one had dared believe possible for 20 years. The ultimate truth had emerged, and the man sitting across from him had no escape. Immediately after the interrogation sessions showed Barlow could offer no reasonable explanation for the key details in the case, the Georgia prosecutor's office formally announced the indictment. Barlow was charged with the most serious offenses: child abduction, aggravated assault, intentional infliction of serious injury, and attempted murder. When the case moved to court, the prosecutor organized all the evidence into 4 main groups. 4 pillars forming the backbone of the prosecution that any defense attorney would find nearly impossible to dismantle. The first group of evidence, the strongest and indisputable, was the DNA strand extracted from Ava's clothing and body in 1990, when reanalyzed with modern technology, produced a complete profile that matched perfectly with the DNA stored in the CODIS system for Dennis Ray Barlow. This wasn't partial similarity, not possible or close. It was a full match at all tested loci. The prosecutor emphasized this in court on the very first day of trial, stating there was no possibility of error or contamination in the results. The second group was the sketch. The drawing Ava provided in 1990, when she couldn't speak and had to communicate on paper, was placed next to Barlow's driver's license photo from the year of the crime. The two images were so alike that the jury could not ignore it. The drooping eyebrows, tired facial expression, dark greasy hair, face shape, and jaw angle were nearly identical. The prosecutor argued that an 8-year-old child could not invent these details in shock and pain unless she had truly seen that man. The third group was the timeline, the sequence of events, and Barlow's movements at the time of the crime. His residency records in Waycross aligned with his work period in Brunswick. Cigarette purchase receipts, travel documents, and a 1991 traffic ticket showed he frequently drove the route, connecting the two towns at night. The entire route, Ava described in her 1990 written statement, from the school lights to the stretch with tall trees, matched the path Barlow could have taken if he had driven her away from the apartment. The prosecutor presented a map, marking each point Ava remembered and each point where Barlow had been, creating an undeniable chain of connections. The fourth group was physical evidence. The fabric fibers found on Ava's clothing, once deemed unidentified in 1990, were now analyzed and showed a structure nearly identical to the lining of the jacket seized from Barlow's closet in the garage. The soil stuck in Ava's hair contained minerals characteristic of the area where Barlow had worked. The old sedan he owned in those years had torn interior in the exact spot Ava described and was noted to have a strong cigarette smell, features matching the victim's hospital description. During the trial, the defense attorney attempted to argue that Barlow remembered nothing about 1990, that the sketch was just random similarity, and that the DNA could have been cross-contaminated. But the prosecutor countered quickly, if it was contamination, why did all the different samples from clothing to tissue point to the same DNA? If it was random, why did the sketch match Barlow's photo almost perfectly? If Barlow didn't remember, why did his travel timeline align completely with the route the victim described on the night of the attack? The trial lasted many days, with appearances from DNA experts, forensic analysts, original investigators, the K-9 team, and even the doctors who treated Ava in night. Many on the jury were silent as they read the papers Ava wrote in the shaky handwriting of a child who had just endured horror. Among them was the line the prosecutor read aloud in court. He said his name was Dennis. When closing arguments ended, the jury took only a short time to reach a verdict. The sentence was read in a packed courtroom. Dennis Ray Barlow was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Barlow stood motionless as the sentence was announced. No strong reaction, no shouting, just staring down at his cuffed hands. The hands that had attacked Ava Turner nearly 2 decades earlier. Whitaker, standing behind the prosecutor, simply nodded quietly. He knew this sentence could not erase what Ava had endured, but at least justice had been delivered to the one who deserved it. The Ava Turner case, once buried in silence for nearly 20 years, finally found its conclusion, not by luck, but by the perseverance of a surviving child and modern forensic technology that gave voice to what. Immediately after the court announced the verdict, and the Ava Turner case file was officially closed, the GBI compiled the entire case-solving process into a special report submitted to the state of Georgia. This was not just a summary closing a nearly 2-decade-old case, but also a document marking the remarkable progress of forensics and DNA technology in handling cold cases. Whitaker and the technical team were asked to describe each step in detail, from reopening old evidence, reanalyzing it with modern technology, to matching an 8-year-old victim's description with the National DNA Database. In the opening section of the report, the GBI affirmed that the key factor in solving the case lay not only in new data, but in restructuring the case from the ground up. Preserving the 1990 evidence, even under limited technology, was the critical foundation that allowed exploitation 20 years later. The evidence bags once thought least valuable, like the small soil patch in Ava's hair, or fabric fibers mixed in her clothes, became pivotal thanks to Mini-Astra and LCN technology. The report emphasized that no evidence is useless forever, only that technology hasn't yet been able to hear the stories they carry. The GBI also noted that the 1990 sketch, created from the statement of a child who couldn't speak, remained vital throughout the reopening process. Not because it was decisive legal evidence, but because it provided the initial image, helping investigators think in the right direction and connect data when the DNA match appeared. This was proof of the value of sketching skills in assaults where victims cannot speak, and a reminder that children's memory, when elicited with proper techniques, can be surprisingly accurate. The next important section of the report analyzed the evolution of DNA technology. In 1990, the perpetrator's DNA samples could only confirm presence of male cells, completely useless for identification. But when STR, mini-STR, LCN and next-generation CODIS systems emerged, tiny samples became traceable data sources. GBI technicians described rerunning old samples as unlocking information once trapped by equipment limitation. From this, the GBI recommended to the entire state all cold cases with biological evidence should be periodically reviewed, especially when new testing technology becomes available. Many old cases have been solved through DNA, and the Ava Turner case became a prime example, proving that time does not weaken forensic power. On the contrary, it strengthens it when technology advances enough to exploit traces too small for humans to foresee. Beyond DNA, the report also highlighted the role of geographic profiling. Whitaker reconstructed the perpetrator's route based on the victim's statement, old maps, streetlight locations, environment, and residency data from that era. Narrowing down Waycross based on movement logic and behavior made verification more feasible. Combining forensics with spatial analysis is a model the GBI recommends for every unsolved case, needing re-evaluation. Additionally, the GBI noted that Ava's handwritten statement, once viewed as too young to fully trust, was the most valuable document. Every scribbled letter contained verifiable data, car description, cigarette smell, torn seats, route, perpetrator's appearance, and especially the name Dennis. When placed in the context of the later DNA match, Ava's statement became the perfect piece, proving the victim not only survived, but directly contributed to solving the case. The report concluded that the Ava Turner case is one of the most successful cold case models in Georgia investigation history. It demonstrates the importance of three factors: 1. Proper evidence preservation, persistent case reopening, 3. Modern forensic technology. The GBI also used this case as a foundation for training the next generation of investigators. Forensic courses on microsample analysis, timeline reconstruction, and interrogation techniques for cold case suspects all use pieces from the Ava case as prime example. Many investigators call it the model case study, not because of the perpetrator's brutality, but because of the accuracy and determination of everyone involved in solving it. Finally, the report dedicated a separate section to mentioning Ava, now an adult, as a symbol of resilience and unrelenting perseverance. The GBI affirmed, without the victim's statement and the 8-year-old girl's fight to survive in the Ava Turner case closed, but the forensic value and investigative lessons it left behind will continue to pave the way for many other cold cases in the future. Cases once forgotten, but now given another chance to hear the voice of truth. In the story of Ava Turner in Georgia, what haunts most is not just the crime, but the way justice was finally served through the combination of the victim's voice, technology, and the persistence of the investigative system. In today's United States, where people are busy, constantly moving, living in cities and towns like Brunswick or Waycross, this story reminds us that what seems like past events can still return and redefine the concept of justice. An 8-year-old girl, lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, only able to scribble a few lines about a man with black hair, oily skin, torn car seats, strong cigarette smell, and the name Dennis. Those details, in the 1990 context, seemed far too fragile, but nearly 2 decades later, those very lines combined with DNA from Ava's clothing and hair became the pillars that allowed the GBI and the CODIS system to identify Ray Barlow. The real-world lesson for American society today: trust and record victims' accounts, even if they are children and even if the situation is chaotic. Don't dismiss them thinking, how can a kid remember accurately? The story also speaks to the importance of preserving and respecting evidence. If Brunswick PD and GBI had not carefully sealed the clothing, fabric fibers and soil samples in 1990, there would have been nothing to analyze with Mini-History or LCN. In everyday American life, from home security cameras, text, emails, to paperwork, those small details are sometimes what protect us in disputes, harassment claims, domestic violence, or crime. Finally, Ava's story reminds us that the system may be slow, but it doesn't have to remain silent forever. In a diverse and complex society like America, continuing to speak up, reporting, keeping records, demanding reinvestigation, is not just a right, but a way each individual helps protect the community from those who seem to have disappeared like Barlow. Thank you for following the entire nearly 2-decade case-solving journey of the Ava Turner case. If you want to continue joining stories of justice like this, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. See you again in the upcoming episodes, where we continue to explore how the truth always finds its way back, no matter how many years it takes.